Okay, so my name is Andrew Patterson. So my current role is as Director of Schools of the CIS Group of Schools. So the CIS Group has 7 schools in Indonesia and also schools in Myanmar, South Korea and India. And I've been doing this role for about a year. But prior to that, I was the head of school of 2 or 3 different schools over the last 13 or 14 years. So in my current role, I have been leading a great team who have put together school opening and closing plans. And so that's why I guess I was asked to present on opening schools safely today. So I hope that you find it useful. I want you to be aware that it's not possible to do a comprehensive opening plan during a 2-hour Zoom session. I'm sure you're all very well aware of that. But I'm hoping that over the course of the next hour and a half to 2 hours, that you will be able to pick out some key things that will assist you as you plan for your own schools. Each school, of course, is unique with a unique set of students and parents and teachers. And of course, you'll have to develop plans that apply to your situation. So my goal in this meeting today is not to give you directions as to what you should do and when, but to really present certain areas that you need to consider. And in doing that, I'm hoping there'll be some good discussion also between the schools, and you'll be able to pick up some tips and some ideas from each other as well. So you will see here in my plan for today, I've got 6 main areas to cover. But what I'm going to do is after each section, we're going to stop for a bit of a discussion and question and answer time. So if you do want to ask a question, feel free to type it in the chat window or just make a note yourself. And then at the right time, Ms. Mala and I will invite you to ask your questions, also to engage in some discussion point by point. So hopefully that will help you, but I'm looking forward to also getting to know you during those 6 discussions that we'll have during the next 2 hours. So you can see there that I'm going to cover identifying risks and clarifying goals when it comes to reopening plans. And actually, reopening plans are not that much different to closing plans. They both require the same kind of structure, actually. So some things will apply to both. But it's important to identify risks in both cases and clarify goals. Looking at keeping and keeping the support of stakeholders, ensuring that systems are sustainable and resilient, managing well-being, looking at different kinds of hybrid modes of learning, and then finally looking at learning loss and adaptation. So that's the plan for the next couple of hours. So I hope that you find it useful. I'm not a scientist or a medical doctor, so I'll not be giving any medical advice here. But I'm hoping that you'll be able to learn some things that will help you to apply the medical advice to your particular situations. Okay, so when it comes to putting together a plan for reopening schools after a period of closure due to the pandemic or for any other reason, the process is not that different to what you do anyway as school leaders. I believe that you are all experienced school leaders, and so you are already well aware of the risk management process. There are many ways that can be described, but basically it comes down to identifying what the risks are of any particular activity, putting together a plan to minimize those risks or to stop those risks from becoming a reality, putting that plan into place, and then monitoring that plan to make sure that it actually works as you expect. So that's a standard risk management process that I'm sure that you do when you plan your field trips and when you plan your science lab experiments and when you plan to build a new building. We're all very used to this process as school leaders. And the same basic process applies for school opening and closing. So the planning process that we went through at the CIS group of schools would have taken us maybe 60 or 70 hours, I guess, of work to go through all the detail and all the different considerations that must go into place to make sure that this is done effectively. It's important, you know, because lives are at risk and also students' education, and therefore their futures is also at risk. And so it's important that we all get this right. So let's start with looking at the risks of opening. So when we come to, I know that some schools in this group have already opened, some have not yet opened, some are opening right now, and so you're all at different places. But these plans also need to be revisited and gone over again and again. So even if you have already opened, you will be able to help us out by contributing, in the discussion time also. And maybe you might consider revising your plan as a result of this, this seminar. So for me, I've divided the risks into 3 levels in increasing level of severity. So what I would call the level 1 risk is the obvious. It's the on-campus transmission. So you open the school, students come in, and someone at the school has COVID-19, and they then transmit that to someone else who then becomes infected. So we need to make sure that we have some systems and procedures in place to minimize the risk of that happening. We don't want anyone to be infected within our school. So that's the level 1, first level of risk. But there is a second level of risk, and that is an outbreak within the school community. So this goes beyond just the idea of 1 or 2 people getting infected on your campus, but this is where those 1 or 2 people then infect 1 or 2 people more, and then they infect more people still. And then we start to find an escalating number of people infected by COVID-19. This becomes a very serious situation then, and it's going to increase the likelihood of severe consequences. So we need to have systems in place to avoid an outbreak happening. So here's where you probably want to look at contact tracing. I'm sure that you're aware of this. The idea that once you know of an infection, you try and find everyone who had contact with the infected person and then try and quarantine them and isolate them or test them for COVID-19. So level 1 is stopping transmission. Level 2 is once you have some transmission, stopping it from spreading. And then for level 3, this is the most serious level, and this is where we have critical impacts on individuals. Sadly, in schools around the world, we have heard of especially teachers and parents who have passed away as a result of COVID-19. And some also have serious long-term health consequences, even if they don't pass away. And that's every school leader's worst nightmare. I'm sure that you'll agree with me. Someone in your school community passing away from something that happened, on campus or at school. So we want to try and work really hard to make the risk of that very, very low. So in order to minimize the risk of this critical impact on individuals, we need to start to look at higher risk groups. So you are all aware from the media and the medical information that's been shared around the world that there are certain people who are at a higher risk of serious outcomes, serious negative outcomes from COVID-19. And so the ones that are most well known, of course, are pre-existing conditions and age. Those that are older and those that have certain kinds of medical conditions already, heart disease, diabetes, those kinds of things, they're at a much higher risk of getting a serious negative outcome, such as death or long-term disease. And so we've got to have a look at those particular groups in our community. Because we need to try and find a way that even if there is transmission in your community, even if you end up having an outbreak despite your best efforts, we want to make sure that even if that happens, we really avoid this very high risk group being impacted. And so you might need to think in your community, what can you do for those that are at this higher level of risk? So some schools, for example, and we are among those, are saying that, okay, if the students have grandparents at home or people that have pre-existing conditions, they shouldn't come to school during school opening while the virus is still, multiplying in the local community, because the risk is just too high of a really negative outcome. Some schools are saying that teachers in those particular situations should not come on campus. And it's going to depend a little bit on your community. It's going to depend on how much the virus is multiplying in your community at any one time. But these are the kinds of decisions you've got to make to protect those that are most vulnerable from serious health outcomes. Now, but there are also other kinds of, I guess, different risks that are out there in addition to the health risk. And so when it comes to making decisions about learning, about student learning, whether that's at home in distance education, whether that's in a hybrid situation, or whether that's full-time on campus, but the pandemic is still happening around us, the choices that we make are going to impact learning. And so different students come from different kinds of situations. And so some households have many people in one house where there may not be opportunity for privacy. It may be difficult, maybe no internet access, no TV potentially, maybe lots of interruptions. For some people, learning at home is very challenging. But for others, where there is internet access, where there is parents who can support and help their children, distance learning is actually quite effective. And so we have to look at how our actions affect different kinds of groups of people. During COVID-19, we've seen lots of negative family impacts. Sometimes families lose their jobs, they can't work, so there's real financial pressures. This can lead to anxiety and maybe even fighting in the community, people who are anxious and fearful of being infected by COVID, sad because of loved ones who have passed away. All these things affect the emotions of the students, of the teachers, of the parents, of you as school leaders as well. And so we cannot ignore all those differences as we plan our reopening program. We have to take account of them in some kind of way. There are also, of course, individual and behavioral differences. We all know in our classrooms that there are some students who are actually very conscientious. They're the students who will work by themselves and do their homework and who are able to adapt to new situations. But there are others who can't, others who find that difficult. And there are all kinds of special needs also that may make working from home or a hybrid way of learning or a full-time on-campus learning after having been in these bad situations for some time quite difficult. And so we also need to look at these kinds of individual and behavioral differences as well. So we've had a look in brief at some of the key risks of opening and some of the things we have to consider when we plan for opening. But what about the risks of not opening? This is also very significant and should be considered in our plans. So we know that school is about a lot more, than just teaching information from a textbook or teaching skills. When students come to school, they are learning to get on with each other. They're learning social skills, behavioral skills. They're learning to meet expectations of their elders, of their leaders. They're learning to know when to have fun and when to be serious. They're learning what kind of behavior is okay and not okay in a school environment. This is all part of learning. Now, if students have been at home 2, 3, 4, 5 months, sometimes up to a year, maybe even more potentially than a year, they've been away from school-based learning, these impacts can be very significant. And we just don't know the full extent to which it will impact students' behavior on re-entry. And it's going to be worse the longer the distance learning happens. And so you can imagine, right, you've got maybe a 6 or 7 year old in the school, and in primary 1, 2, and 3, each year they become more and more socially adept. They start to learn better how to communicate with their peers. They learn more about how to learn from themselves, how to ask questions. These things happen gradually, year by year by year. What is the impact of 6 months, 9 months, 12 months of not having that? And how will that impact the students' development and growth in the following years? This is quite a serious impact that we should be looking for. Of course, there's also mental health and family life impacts. As I mentioned before, some families could be very, very impacted by COVID-19. There may have been serious illness, there may have been dislocation, there may have been financial implications as well. And so sometimes these crises lead to mental health issues also in children, in their parents, in teachers in our schools that we need to be aware of. The longer students are away from school and the safety nets that we have in place and the support of the community that we deliver through schools, the more isolated they might become and the more these risks can multiply. So it's really not healthy for the majority of students to be isolated for too long because of these kinds of impacts that can happen. Of course, there are also physical impacts, and one of the key ones in some places is the risk of infection while students are at home. So in some ways, schools can be kind of a safe place, you know, during a pandemic, because the school leaders and the teachers can put together a system. They can do temperature checking, they can do social distancing, they can wear masks, they can monitor what the students are doing, they can do hand washing. There are many things in a structured school that you can do to minimize the risk of infection. But if those students are at home, in their communities, in their households, are they being as careful, or are they out playing sport with their friends? Are they going to the shopping malls? Are they mixing with large numbers of relatives and their family? And so is the risk actually outside the home stronger than the risk in school? That may or may not be the case. So these things also have to be considered as risks of not opening the school. And then finally, of course, there is both a short and a long-term learning impact. Missing school does have a negative impact on learning. And once again, it's going to impact different kinds of students in different ways. And so if the student has a good distance learning program, access to the internet, they're self-motivated, they've developed some independent learning skills, then they can maybe pretty much keep up. But there are a lot of students who don't have that environment and don't have those abilities. And so for them, there's going to be a real loss of learning that takes place. And again, the longer we stay closed, the more that learning loss will multiply and the greater the impact on their lives for years to come. I'm not going to read through these incomplete surveys, these complete studies. I'm just going to highlight a couple of studies that I've found about loss of learning. So the one at the top here that you can see is a study that was done about student absence from a school. I'm going to read the highlighted part. This report found that students who arrived at school academically ready to learn, but then missed 10% of their kindergarten and first grade years, scored an average of 60 points below similar students who had good attendance in the third grade. So even at kindergarten and lower primary level, we see that even 10% of loss of schooling has an impact for years to come. And there's been many studies that have also demonstrated this. And on the left-hand side, in the US, they have a long summer break, 3 months over the summer. And there have been many studies done about the impact of that long 3-month break every year. So in this study, the authors concluded that on average, student achievement scores declined over summer vacation by 1 month's worth of school year learning. So by having 3 months holiday every year, during that time, on average, students lose 1 month of learning. They go back 1 month from where they left at the end of the previous year. And then every year we have to start again, you know, to revise that material to get back to the same place again. So there are many studies on this, but this just goes to show that school is important. School impacts learning, it impacts performance, and even quite a small absence from a school can seriously impact learning. And then, of course, once you get behind, that multiplies. You know, once you've missed the prerequisites for something, and then you shift ahead to the new curriculum that applies to the following year, you are already behind and struggling because you haven't got the foundation in place. So quite serious implications potentially with negative impacts on their lives and their futures if this goes on too long. So there are both positive, there are both risks to do with opening, but also risks to do with not opening that we have to take into consideration. So in looking at this as a whole then, so what would be some acceptable and realistic goals? Let's clarify our goals of reopening the school, whether we're reopening in a hybrid kind of mode or whether we're reopening in terms of a full on-campus, a full campus opening. So the biggest risk that I've observed, I guess, is the danger out there that you as school leaders and me as a school leader might overpromise both parents and the students and maybe even our board, you know, and the authorities in our system of what we can deliver when it comes to opening the school in terms of managing the risk. So of course, it's very natural for any school leader, isn't it, right? We want to inform our community about all the steps we've taken to protect their kids. We want them to know that we've worked hard for them. We want them to know that we want them to come to school and get the benefits of learning at school. We want them to feel trust and confidence in us. And so that's the way we normally communicate to our parent community and to our student community. But if we just do that, there's a real risk that parents and students will assume that therefore there is no risk. And if they think that, and then later on there is a case of COVID in your school, there's an outbreak in your school, they're going to then be asking some very tough and hard questions of you as a school leader as to why your systems didn't work. You know, why couldn't you prevent this happening in your school? So it's really important that at the same time that we are promoting our safety measures, at the same time that we are building confidence to come back to school, we must also always say, but we cannot eliminate any risk. If COVID-19 is out there in the community, if it's multiplying in the community around us, it's impossible to prevent it from coming into the school eventually. Unless we treat the school like a hospital and we all wear full PPE and, you know, we have one student per classroom, at that point, it's almost no point in opening school anyway, right? We may as well just stay on distance learning. And so parents need to be aware that there still is a risk. The risk of COVID-19 is a community risk. It exists everywhere in the community. Even inside hospitals, there is a risk of getting infected. And so it's important that we don't promise parents that there is no risk. And so what I recommend and what I suggest is that every time you speak to parents or you write to parents or you communicate to parents and you tell them all about the school opening features, also add, but we cannot guarantee there will be no infection. And it's kind of awkward to say that, but you've got to say it. It's going to protect you in the future when parents come back to you and say, why didn't you clarify, you know, your goals at the beginning? Why didn't you let me know there was some risk? And so that's part of the good communication that must take place. So that's an important thing to focus on as school leaders, the way we communicate. The other area that I want to look at is how do we support highly risk-averse stakeholders? So by risk-averse, I mean these are those parents or teachers or students who are always kind of very, very cautious and careful. You know, these are the kinds of parents that maybe will never send their child to someone else's house for a sleepover. These are the kinds of parents who will never let their children go on public transport by themselves. These are the kind of parents who maybe argue with you about going on a field trip. Is it safe enough? So there are always some people that are more risk averse, more worried, right, about risk than others. if we target our reopening plan toward the desires of the most risk averse, then we're going to get nowhere, because we're not going to be able to open the school to their satisfaction, right? To their satisfaction. So we can't aim that high, but we still do need to account for those highly risk averse stakeholders. And the key question here is, if there are people in your community who refuse to send their children to school when you reopen it, how are you going to handle those people? Maybe 5%, 10%, 20%. It'll depend on your community. If there are people that are just too fearful to come on campus, how are you going to talk to those people? How are you going to manage their children's education during this time? That's a really challenging question that school leaders need to ask themselves in advance, because it will happen. I'm not going to read through these, but I just found some on social media. I found some comments from different parents, some from Denmark, some from India, that are kind of saying, look, I don't want my child to be at risk. Don't make my child a guinea pig, or don't experiment on them. Their safety is my priority. And these kind of parents are going to push back on any plan to open the school. So we've got to respect their point of view. There's no right or wrong here. It's just their point of view. And so somehow we need to know how to speak to those parents and how to manage them in our system. So the next section I'm going to talk about is getting and keeping support of stakeholders. And there are actually already some good leads into this discussion that we just heard. So when it comes to managing any crisis that may happen in our communities, the support of stakeholders is critical. Sometimes you can have fantastic plans that seem to be all perfect and you can tick all the boxes and everything seems good. But if you don't have the support of the parents and your community and the government, then you're going to find yourself in a real mess and a real problem. And so by stakeholders, I mean parents, students, teachers, and regulators and the boards that many of us have to deal with. And so all these groups of people are important, and there may be more other stakeholders in your communities. So these are all important people that we need to make sure that we get their support for what we're doing and keep their support, because they're only going to comply with your requests if they're with you, you know. So if you tell parents, don't come to school, don't send your kids to school if they're sick. But if the parents don't trust you, they don't realize what you're doing, they don't understand your goals, they may say, oh, I'm just going to do it anyway, right? Just send my kids even though they're sick. So getting compliance to your school structure and your school rules will be much, much easier if you have the support of stakeholders. And as things change, sometimes something might happen and you may lose their confidence. Then you've got to get their confidence back again, right? To make sure that you're always trying to communicate well to do that. So there are two key aspects, and this is the same for all kinds of communication, isn't it? Targeted messaging and regular feedback. So it's really important that we think very carefully about how we are going to communicate with those different stakeholders. Now, of course, parents and students are key, and teachers are key as well. But maybe as a school leader, you're also reporting and listening to, you know, what your regulators are saying. So making sure that we communicate well with those people, but also hearing back from them how they are reacting to what you are saying. So it can't be just one way. It must be two-way communication in which there's a sense that we're all in this together, right? So you build community support by sharing, by being honest and transparent with them about what's happening in the school, and listening for their feedback and making adjustments as you go. So there are some key things to look at here, just some key tips, I guess, I want to share with you, and maybe others also have some tips to share. The first thing is to be really quite, I guess, focused on who is responsible for communication. Because it's very easy to say, okay, we've got to communicate well, but who's going to do that? And who's going to keep on doing that after 1 month, after 2 months, after 3 months? If you open the school in hybrid mode and there's some problems that happen, who is in charge of communicating with parents, who's in charge of communicating with students, who's going to do that? Because it's always the risk, right, that everyone thinks someone else is going to do it. So my advice is to try and have someone in charge or a committee in charge of communicating with all the stakeholders at those appropriate points along the way. People can handle a lot of stress. People can handle a lot of adversity if they know what's going on. If they feel the school is keeping them informed, if they feel the school is trying their best, if they feel that, that they are being listened to. And so that's going to be really critical for how successful your reopening plan is. So think about who's responsible. One of the things that can happen though is that if there's lots and lots of communication, sometimes people can get tired, all right, in the end of reading so much or hearing so much information over and over again. One great idea that I think works quite well is to kind of mix up who sends the information, because some information might come from the district or the ministry. Some information might come from the school, from you as the school leader. Others might come from the teacher to the parents of the students in their class. And in some cases, we can use also the parent support groups or the PTA, whatever it is that you call the body of parents within your school. They can also be sources that you can use to help you communicate with the wider parent body. Now, of course, this must be very well coordinated, so everyone is saying the same thing and saying the same message, right? That's very important. But, you know, if you're hearing something from the president of the parent support group, that might be more powerful in some ways than hearing it from the principal or from the district superintendent or from one of the teachers in the school. So you might want to think about, you know, getting some people together and working out, okay, the school leader is going to communicate about this, but then the teacher will give more detail direct to their parents, right? And then maybe for this new feature that's coming in that we're going to bring in, let's get the leader of the parent group to announce that. And so by having different people involved in the communication, you might reach more people. That's just one idea that you can use. Now, surveys are always a key way that we get parent and student feedback. So I don't know how you currently handle surveys and parent and student feedback in your school. Maybe you use physical forms, maybe you use online surveys, maybe there's phone calls or meetings where you get feedback. It's going to depend on your situation. But certainly you need to have some kind of mechanism for hearing feedback, not just once, but several times, right, over the course of a couple of months, to make sure that if things are changing, you are aware of that quickly so that you can respond. So it might be very challenging in some situations. So if the students are working from home and they don't have internet, it might be only a phone call that you can use. It's going to be challenging if you've got, you know, a very large number of students. So you're going to have to work out, you know, at school level, how you'll handle some kind of survey or feedback loop. But it's critically important that you do that. We're doing that monthly in the SIS schools, monthly surveys of students, parents, and teachers, just so that we can get fast feedback of how things are going in an environment of rapid change, right, and uncertainty. And so we can respond quite quickly. So think about that, how that may work in your communities. If you have access to social media or websites, if you can create videos or do messaging directly to mobile phones, those are all great ways to communicate with different kinds of groups of people. I know yesterday people were saying that sometimes there's not very much internet. Maybe only half the population has the internet. Not everyone has TVs, but almost everyone has a mobile phone. And so that may be your key way to communicate, whether it's by SMS, text messaging, or whether it's through some other format. But think about your community and the variety of ways that you can communicate. The more effort you put into this, the more reward that you get at the end. Targeted online meetings. So if you do have a community where there is reasonable internet access and you can have video conferences like this with parents, that's great. Sometimes the big meetings can be difficult to answer personal questions. So you might want to have 1 or 2 big meetings, but then have teachers also have meetings just for their own parents or their own children. So they can really hear the parents' point of view and answer their questions and make sure there's good feedback happening that way. I know that not every school is able to do that. Whatever you do, we need to make sure that parents and students know where to go when there's a problem. If they don't know what to do, they don't know if school is open or closed, they don't know, what subjects are being taught tomorrow, they don't know about uniform issues or about, what to do with food. You need to have some way that the parents or students can contact the school or the teachers and respond quite quickly. Parents get frustrated if they're already under stress, if they have to wait a long time for feedback. So you may need to have more people than normal handling communication in your school. Some schools that I work with have done this. They've realized that during this time, there's going to be more need than normal for communication with parents. So let's try and get more people who normally do different things in our school communities to focus on answering the phone, responding to emails, handling messaging via mobile phones and that kind of thing. It really does make a big difference to how the community feels about what you as a school leader are doing during this crisis. Just a couple of ideas here, some key words, I guess, when it comes to communication. These are all things that are good aspects of good communication whenever we do it, but become even more important in a crisis. And being aware, of the parent's situation, having empathy for them, not coming across as just listing all the rules. Here's what we have to do. Here's what parents are obliged to do, but also recognizing some of these families are in a crisis. Someone's passed away. They haven't got enough money to buy food for the next day. They're stressed out at home. They're feeling anxious. We need to make sure we deliver with a certain level of empathy in order to maintain parent support. And that can be hard, right? Because our school staff and you as a school leader are also stressed during this time. And you may also feel a bit sharper and shorter than you might normally feel. So managing that and choosing the right people to communicate makes a big difference when it comes to communication. Okay, the next section to talk about is about our systems. So we talked about the risks that we have to manage, the risk of opening and not opening. We talked about the communication and getting the support of our stakeholders. But as we develop our systems, our safety systems, our learning systems, how do we make sure they will be sustainable and resilient over time? Because no one really knows how long this will go for. And even if you've already opened schools, you'll be well aware, right, that there are schools that have opened and then closed and opened and closed as things change around them. And so until there is a universal vaccine, this could be an issue for quite some time to come. So we can't just think about what's working right now. We've got to make sure our systems will last. So the first thing I think is pretty obvious, but I'll just state it for the record. We really do need to have detailed written procedures. It's not enough just to meet together and say, let's do this or let's do that. These are life and death decisions. And so we need to make sure we put the time into having a detailed written plan that can be reviewed, that you can refer to later on when you forget what you decided. It's there in writing. That's really important for good management. And so someone or some group or some committee needs to be in charge of doing that from the very beginning. As part of those procedures, we need to make sure there's clarity about who is accountable, who is in charge, who is responsible for different things. Because we've also seen around the world, as we see different countries doing different things, sometimes there's confusion about who is in charge of something. And if no one's in charge, sometimes no one does anything. So sometimes when you plan things in a meeting, no one volunteers, right? but we can't have that situation where no one's in charge of it. So as a school leader, you need to appoint someone for all the critical things that must be done. There can't be blanks next to certain activities that must be done, because it's critical what we are doing right now. It's not just everyday teaching and learning. We are handling a crisis situation, and the important things must be done. So the people that you give tasks to need to know what they're responsible for. They need to know how important it is to you as a school leader, and they need to know how you are going to check that moving forward. And that leads me into the next point, which is compliance checking. So it's as you already know, right, as school leaders, it's one thing to give a task to a teacher or a staff member or a vice principal maybe. That's easy to do, easy to give tasks, but we know that sometimes those tasks are not always done, or not always done to the level that we expect. And so as a school leader, we can't just say, oh, I told this person to do it, so therefore it's not my responsibility anymore. We can't do that. We need to make sure the people that we give tasks to do them during a crisis. And so some kind of checking in relation to compliance. So for example, if you allocate people to check temperature as students come into the school, and to make sure that students are distanced 1.5 meters or 1 meter apart, you need to have yourself or someone else needs to check randomly that's actually happening day by day, not just on the first day, but on the 15th day, on the 30th day, after 3 months. That's still happening, and still happening to an appropriate standard. And so as school leaders, we are responsible to check that the people that we give tasks to actually do the tasks. And this must be built into the plan as well. And then finally, a regular review of the plan. Okay, so we create the plan, the written document, we allocate who's in charge of what, we have a system for checking the compliance, but reviewing that plan is also very important. And ideally, it's great to have someone who is not fully involved day by day in managing the school community to also look at your plan. And so if you've got a superintendent, or you've got someone maybe who is a principal of a different school that you can share your plan with, that they can review it and see it with fresh eyes, right? Because there are things that you may not think of that they have thought of. And so that's a great way to make sure that your plan is robust and resilient, and it's going to last appropriately. So maybe when you first went into distance learning, you didn't think about this or about that, but someone thinks of that over time, you add it to the plan. So some kind of regular review is going to be important to make sure that it's sustainable. So maybe you might have, a regular meeting time to review the plan, or maybe it's done, in a more ad hoc way, but there should be some opportunity to do this for the community. Okay, the next section is about managing well-being. And this is also something that's important to focus on because, again, as I mentioned before, our schools aren't just only about teaching and learning. We are responsible for the students under our care. We have a duty of care to our students and their families to make sure they are healthy and well, and we are doing the best that we can to give them a good experience of learning at school. And so thinking about their well-being, thinking about how our decisions will impact teachers and staff, students and parents in particular. At each level of decision-making, thinking about how it's going to affect different people's well-being. So teachers and staff, for example, if they're doing distance learning, so either whether it's in full-time distance learning, or whether you're doing a hybrid where it's 50-50, for example, and they're doing some distance learning, sometimes teachers might be finding that very overwhelming. They might find they've got their own children at home with them to manage while they're also teaching. There may be, internet issues, or there may be communication issues. There may be sickness in their family. All kinds of things could be going on. So what are we doing to care for our teachers to make sure they're doing okay, to make sure that we aren't making things worse for them? Students also, We've already talked about some of the differences that students bring to the table when it comes to their households, their individual differences and so on. Some of them are reading the social media, they're stressed about the stories, they're worried about grandma or grandpa passing away, they see their parents anxious, they're worried about money. These things affect their well-being. And if we're trying to force them to focus only on logarithms, you know, or calculus, and that's our only focus, we are not considering them as whole people who have other kinds of needs as well. So how are we going to manage that well-being? Parents also in our community maybe are going to be a little bit more stressed, a little bit more anxious. Maybe they react in a more angry way than they would normally do because they're under stress, under pressure. So our acceptance of that is an important part of our job as a school leader as well, and to cater for their different situations. So if you have a distance learning plan in which you require the parent to teach the child, but that parent has to work at the same time or has 3 or 4 children at home to manage, you're putting a very big stress load on the parent. So thinking about the impact on the parent is going to be important in any plan that involves some element of distance learning. So these become critical things. So I've got a few ideas to share with you, but again, as I mentioned with communication, who's in charge of this? If it's important to you as a school leader, someone, a committee, a person, or you yourself must be in charge of managing well-being, keeping your eye on how students are doing, getting that feedback from students, that feedback from parents, so you know how they're feeling, how they're doing, and whatever you try and do to improve their well-being, how will you measure if it's working or not? Maybe through surveys, maybe through meetings, maybe through phone calls. There's a variety of ways. The biggest thing, you know, as I've been reading about this and talking to other school leaders, everyone seems to believe, you know, that the biggest thing that any of us can do to help our teachers, our students, our parents, is just to encourage them to share, encourage them to talk about it. You know, when you ask someone to share about their personal situation, it just demonstrates that you care. It demonstrates that to you, they are more than just a student. They are more than just a parent or a teacher. They are a person. And so just asking in itself can make a big difference. You know, teachers and parents and students can be resilient, but they also need our empathy and our understanding and for us to listen to them. I was discussing this with one of the deputy head teachers at one of our schools, you know, and he was sharing with me how difficult it is to get students, especially teenagers, to share. And of course, that's true. And so we've got to be creative, you know, in the ways that we get our students to talk about things, to talk about their situation, talk about how they're feeling, maybe through a game, maybe through a prompt, you know, or some kind of stimulus that's going to get them talking and interacting and having a bit of a laugh together as well, just to break the tension if they're feeling under stress. And so one of the principals that I spoke to recently is calling every single teacher in his school. So he has, I think, about 95 teachers in his school. And so he is calling every one of them and sharing, asking how they're doing, how's their home life going, how they're operating, what are their needs. That means that all the teachers know that this head teacher cares about them as people. That's going to make them want to work hard, want to please him, want to do a good job for their students. So whether it's students, parents, or teachers, encouraging sharing can be a great way. If parents are under financial stress, someone yesterday raised the issue of school fees. And of course, most private schools are struggling right now with this. Parents that can no longer afford to pay fees or that have had financial impacts from COVID-19. How does the school support those parents while still staying afloat itself? And they're very challenging questions for every school to deal with. But certainly empathy and showing concern for families in difficult situations is a key part of that. Physical, mental health, and grief support. So we need to think in advance, what are we going to do in the worst case scenario? Say one of the students in your school, their parent passes away or their grandparent passes away, or even worse, one of your students passes away. What are you going to do in your school community? Everyone's upset. Everyone's, anxious that it may happen to them next. People are missing that person. How are you going to bring everyone together and help them get through the grief that's going to be a part of that? So thinking in advance about the resources that you have in your community. Do you have counselors that you can reach out to? Are there certain people on your teaching team that you know are very good at counseling and supporting students and families? Identify those people in advance, right? To make sure that if this happens, you haven't got to suddenly come up with a plan. You already have a plan and you can implement that plan right away, and you know how to be supportive of those families and students who need it during that time. So if there's a physical impact on a certain family, a mental health impact where someone is very anxious and is not able to come to school, if someone has lost a loved one, how as a school will you support the community? For teachers, teacher workload is going to be a big issue. Someone's already raised that. I'm going to come to that again a bit later on. But teacher workload, their own family context, is going to be an important part of thinking about their well-being. But one thing to highlight, I guess, is for those schools that are operating with online learning, if you are using online environments, this makes some teachers feel very vulnerable, because if they are recording themselves or the student is recording them, it's very easy for the student to share that with someone else or for the parents to see it and then speak badly about that teacher, maybe picking up on the teacher's bad grammar or poor vocabulary, or maybe the teacher loses their temper briefly, and that can be then highlighted and shared with other people. So of course, teachers are going to feel vulnerable, during this, and they're going to feel scared that maybe someone will take advantage of them. So this is an important thing to deal with. So one thing that you can do, and is what we did also, is to get students together to sign an agreement about how they're going to handle this kind of thing during distance learning, and parents also. So our students signed an agreement that they would not share things that have been shared online. They would not video clip their teachers. They would not try and intimidate or embarrass their teachers or their peers based on what happens in the classroom. If you say that up front and make it clear the reason why you're doing that, students and parents are generally supportive of that. It's just making them think from the beginning, look, these teachers are putting themselves out there in a way they wouldn't normally do. Teachers don't normally have people watching their classrooms. They don't normally have parents in their room watching everything they say, but now they do. And so addressing this with your community in advance will show the teachers that you are understanding and supportive of what they are doing. And then the final one here, personal contact makes a big difference. I already mentioned before about the head teacher who's calling every single teacher in his school to make sure they're okay. This can also be done with students and families if you have the staff to handle this. You might like to have some training though. Not everyone is very natural when it comes to showing empathy and support. Some people have different kinds of personalities and may need some guidance as to what they do and don't say on those kinds of calls. Otherwise, your best intentions may be counterproductive, right? You get a teacher to call the parents, but that teacher offends the parents when she or he calls them. So some kind of guidance and some kind of training could be done just to make sure that people know the right way to show empathy, to show care, to be a good listener, how to handle complaints in a good kind of way is done in advance to minimize the impact on that. Okay, so I'm now going to talk a bit about the hybrid modes of learning. And so, as I just mentioned, there are many different ways of doing this. There's no one right way of handling hybrid modes. One of the critical things, though, is what I like to call double hybrid. So this is the idea that you go back to school with some students at school one day, but not the next. So Melissa mentioned before the 50-50 model. So maybe that might be on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, students come on campus, but Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, they study from home via distance learning. So teachers are interacting with students on their distance learning day, using the various methods that we use for that, but then also doing classes, on the on-campus day. So that's the standard hybrid model. But then in many cases, you're going to have parents that are full-time via distance. That's what I mean by double hybrid, right? So as well as handling these two different modes of learning for all the students, one day on, one day off, you've also got students that are every day off campus. And that means a whole different way of handling that. And that's going to really increase the load on teachers. Actually, initially, I was not supportive of this. I thought that would be too much for teachers to handle the 50-50 for most students, but then also to handle students who are full-time operating by distance learning. But then over time, I came to realize, actually, we've got to do that. There's no choice. We are going to have students that can't come to school because they are quarantining. We're going to have highly risk-averse parents who will not send their kids to school. We're going to also have times in which we will have to close the school down because of a rising rate of infection in our community or an infection in our own school. So we need to be ready to move in and out of distance and hybrid learning modes and try and find what the best mode is for our school. So it's very challenging, but it can be done, and we're going to talk some more about that coming up. So we need to make sure that we have the goals of hybrid very clear in our minds. Why are we doing this? Why aren't we opening the whole campus? Or why aren't we staying just distance? So there are two key goals of hybrid learning that I can see. The first is, as someone just mentioned just before this, to maintain physical distancing. If everyone's at school, in most cases, it's going to be impossible for students to stay apart. The schools aren't designed for that kind of separation. And so by having some time in school and some time at home, it means you can have less students in the classroom, and therefore you can move their tables further apart. You can manage zones in the school where students can and can't go. Certain pathways can be planned so that students don't mix too much with different groups. This can be done when there are less students on campus. That's the idea behind main idea behind hybrid. But the second reason for doing hybrid is to minimize the contacts that students will have with each other. So if you imagine the school as being divided into Group A and Group B. So Group A comes to school Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Group B comes to school Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, as an example. In that situation, if you find there is an infection that happened on Monday, Group A need to be quarantined until you can do contact tracing and make sure the school is safe again for students to come back. But Group B doesn't need to be affected by that. As long as you can do cleaning of the school overnight and making sure all those things are taken care of, there's no reason to disrupt the learning of Group B. And so by having these two different shifting approaches, it means that the whole school doesn't need to be negatively impacted by an infection in one group. And so those are the two main goals, I think, of hybrid. And I've seen it done in various ways. So alternate days, some schools are doing morning and afternoons are different. So what Group A in the morning, Group B in the afternoon. Other schools are doing 1 week on, 1 week off. Week one is Group A, week B week two is Group B. So there are many different ways that you can do that, but the goals are the same in each case. Now, here's the real question that was asked earlier, that I want to spend quite some time on this, because this is critical when it comes to managing the hybrid mode and teachers during this time. The issue of time efficiency. How on earth are teachers going to be able to handle all these changes and still be able to manage their own household as well effectively without stressing out? And so we've got to now focus on efficiency of time use. You know, when you first suddenly move into distance learning, no one has had much time to plan. Not everyone is used to operating online. People aren't necessarily used to learning from a TV or interacting via mobile phone, all the different ways that it's been done, right? It's not something that's been normal for us. So when we first start, it's inefficient. We're learning as we go. But as time goes on, we must become more efficient in how we deliver this, because otherwise we're going to burn our teachers out. So we've got to try and help the teachers become more efficient in the way they deliver the hybrid and the distance modes of learning. So for me, the key, well, there's two keys. For me, the first key is this. Teachers need to develop a laser-like focus on adapted learning outcomes. So by saying this, looking at the curriculum for a certain grade level, that grade level is likely to have published learning outcomes, those things that are the goals to be met in the teaching and learning process for that particular grade level under normal situations, under the normal environment. We need to adapt that for distance and hybrid models. Otherwise, we burn the teachers out and we also overload the students, because the students are also adapting to a different way of learning. We can't expect it to go on just as it was before. And so we need to make sure that the principal or the curriculum coordinators or the grade level teachers have gone through all the normal learning outcomes and they reduce those. They work out, which are the most important ones to cover, which ones are essential as building blocks of the curriculum for future years. So if I've got a child in secondary one, right? Secondary one, first year of high school, what must they learn this year so that they will be able to successfully achieve secondary 2 learning outcomes next year? So there are some things that are critical like that, but there are also some things that are in there for engagement reasons, for interest reasons, or that may be repeated, right, from previous years that don't need to be repeated again, or that will be repeated in future years, but are not building blocks that need to be built on in the future. And so in your school, the curriculum coordinators or those in charge of this need to go through those learning outcomes as objectives and narrow them down to the essential ones to avoid burnout of teachers or students. So once you've done that, the teachers then may need to adapt their approach to teaching and learning, because I've got a question about this later on in the discussion, but in many schools I've observed, teachers get into a pattern of just teaching to the textbook. So they're used to doing chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3, then chapter 4. And if they try and keep on doing it that way, it's not going to be very efficient in achieving the adapted learning outcomes, because they're going to be teaching things that aren't necessary, and they're going to be giving activities that aren't necessary. So if you're going to become more efficient, you've got to not only adapt the learning outcomes, but convince the teachers to throw away all those things that are no longer relevant and only teach that which is required by those new learning outcomes. Now, this is very challenging for some teachers who have a very set way of doing things and who don't necessarily adapt and think very well on their feet to change their normal practice, but they have to. And we have to encourage them to do that and support them in doing that. Because if they don't, they're going to be overloaded in the end. So if you've got maybe you're doing primary 5 science and you're doing a topic on cells, for example, maybe it's no longer necessary for students to learn about cells in relation to plants. That will be covered in biology in future years. Maybe the key thing to learn about cells is just the structure of cells. Okay, so the learning outcome becomes the structure of cells. So we no longer should be teaching all those things that relate to plant cells. That will be done later on. And we just focus only on this particular kind of structure that we want to teach. So that means leaving out parts of the textbook. That means changing the activities. This means being really, really focused. So rather than having maybe 20 learning outcomes, now there are only 10 or 8 learning outcomes. But for those 8 to 10 learning outcomes, the teacher must deliver those learning outcomes. They're essential. We can't let those things go. It means teacher has to be creative in adjusting their program to their environment, whether it's online or whether it's via worksheets or whether it's by TV delivery and interaction via mail or school visits or whatever it is. Teachers have to adapt to these new learning outcomes. If they just do it the same way as before, they're going to be overloaded. The second thing that teachers need to be encouraged to do is to respond to assessment. So this is actually an area where distance and hybrid learning actually do better than on-campus learning. Because when you've got a whole class of 30 or 40 students in the room, it can be quite challenging to do different things for different groups. So within that class of 40, maybe you've got 10 that are advanced, that know everything already. You've got 10 that maybe don't understand, are struggling, and 20 in the middle. It's quite challenging for teachers to handle those 2 or 3 different groups. They all try and do that, but it can be challenging in a classroom. But if you're doing things by distance, there's an opportunity here to differentiate a lot better. So if you're doing it online, there can be individual discussion back and forward between the teacher and the student, or between the teacher and a small group of students that's separate to the classroom. There can also be specialized assessments and assignments that can be given differently to different students, more easily in some ways in distance learning than it could be on campus. So if we can assess the students and understand what they can and can't do, and then just focus on making sure we meet the learning outcomes, we'll become much more targeted in our approach. It's about becoming more efficient. So rather than doing the same thing for everyone, even if half the class has already got it, that's not efficient. By doing it this way, we can give extra extension, interesting work to the advanced students and focus more on those that haven't got it yet. So we're differentiating to a greater degree. And we can really start to build some good differentiation practices among our teachers. And we can also build some independent learning skills among our students during this COVID time. It might be that silver lining that we are looking for, something that will help us to improve teaching and learning practice in our schools by differentiating between different groups. Now, assessment is challenging, right, in distance learning and in hybrid learning as well. At least in hybrid, you can always do the assessment during the on-campus days, right? So there's less issues to do with honesty and observation, difficulty in observation, that kind of thing. In distance, it's quite hard, but it can still be done. But assessment is more important than ever during distance and hybrid models, because we need to know if the students are learning or not. Because we are trying it in a new way. Never done it before in most cases. How do we know if the students are learning or not in this new way of learning? We've got to find out. We have to assess them and then respond to that assessment. So once we assess them, we don't assess them just to get a score. We assess them so that we know who has and hasn't learned those crucial topics, so we can then follow up with those that didn't get it the first time. And so these two things, I think, are the keys to time efficiency and managing distance and hybrid learning models in a way that doesn't kill the teachers, right? This focusing on the adapted learning outcomes, throwing out all those normal things that we used to do, and just being focused in a creative way, just teaching this, right? It's hard for teachers, right? But we've got to try and help them do that. And the second thing, assessing students as much as ever before, but then responding to that by making sure that we follow up with those students who didn't achieve a good score, who haven't grasped the material sufficiently yet as they move forward. And so that may mean that for some students, you are doing more classes than for other students, but that's okay. Because we are just focusing on the critical learning outcomes during this time, and we can give self-study material and more independent assignments and projects to those students that are more advanced, so that we can focus on those that are struggling during this time. The other thing that we need to look at with both distance and hybrid modes of learning is student engagement. So for the on-campus days, of course, we can see the students in the classroom. Teachers can see, are they paying attention or not? They can see, are they being distracted, looking out the window? Are they talking a lot? Are they not following the class? You can ask questions, you can walk around the classroom, all these things that we normally do as teachers to keep the students engaged and focused. That's fine for on campus, but during the distance learning day, you can't do that. And it really is very, very difficult to manage the students' attention and focus if they're not there in the classroom. And so somehow we've got to find new ways to measure how well students are engaged. You know, normal practice is that at the beginning of the day, children come to school, we mark the attendance off, and they're here for the day. At least we know they're at school, right? But during distance, if they're doing online classes, it may be that they were there for the first 5 minutes, but they may not be there for the rest of the day. They may not be doing anything else during that week. All they do is just log in online, have the attendance taken, and do nothing else. So we can no longer rely on our traditional techniques of taking attendance to give us some idea of how engaged the students are in learning. So you might want to think of other ways of managing that, of observing, you know, are students submitting assignments and tasks? Are they responding to questions? Are they answering the phone when we call? Are they showing signs of engagement? And by monitoring and measuring that, we can then work out, okay, well, which students are struggling? Which students are not being engaged? What are we going to do about that? How are we going to handle these disengaged students? So it's no longer about attendance, it's now about engagement when it comes to the distance learning side of this. Okay, the last section here is about learning loss and adaptation. As I just already mentioned in the previous section, we need to know as a school what has been missed. So, and we need to record that so that we can try and adapt in years to come. So we need to keep records of those learning outcomes that we decide to put to one side. And this, I guess, comes back to what I've already discussed about assessment. So we talked about adapting the curriculum to reducing the expectations of the learning outcomes we would achieve in a certain year. Then we've also got to adapt the assessment as well. Adapt the assessment to make sure, number one, that it's fair, so that students are only being assessed on what they've been taught. And then number two, so that we know which students have and haven't learned that material. If the students have learned it, great, let them move on. If the students haven't learned it, then we need to somehow find another way of teaching them again, finding that time in our program to make sure they don't get left behind. So in distance learning, adapted assessment is more important than ever before. And even though it's challenging, we have to find ways of doing it. And like we discussed in the discussion time, oral assessment can be a great way of doing that. It's time consuming, but it's effective. And then also all the other ways that we can talk about, we can get parents involved and helping us to assess as well. And if we can use the internet, that's also a great way to do testing. There are all kinds of different software applications available for testing. Exam.net is a great one which allows the teacher to control the computer of the student. So that means that the student is stopped from switching screens or searching on Google and things like that. So that there are software solutions to some of this. You can force the student's microphone to be on so you can hear what they're saying during the exam. So if you are advantaged as a school and you are able to do it via online, those kinds of facilities are available. Something like Nearpod is great. Nearpod is an online solution in which the teacher can give every student the question, and then every student at the same time can record their answer. So that means it's not very time consuming because all the students record their answer at once. It just means the teacher has to go through the audio files one by one to hear and mark the student's response. So there are technological solutions if you are online, but if you are not online, You have to try and adapt that to the TV or radio based or the mobile phone based system that you are using. I've already talked about high stakes examinations, about how the school has to decide what you are going to do, what's in the best interest of the students. That's always what it comes down to in teaching and learning. What is in the students' best interest? If it is better for the students not to run the exam and to make some other adjustments later on, do that. If you think it's important for them that they do the exam now, then we need to try and find a way to give them the extra time they need to cover the curriculum. So it may mean that we have to temporarily remove the non-core subjects, the optional subjects, and just focus on what's being assessed in the external exam. So those kind of compromises have to be made at the school level. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we do have the situation in which if COVID is still active in the community, there is likely eventually to be some kind of infection at school. And we've seen this happen right around the world. And so you need to know in advance, how are you going to respond when that happens? So first of all, you need to make sure that, that you find out when this happens. So students and parents and teachers need to have a protocol in which they must inform the school if they are sick, or if they have a COVID test, or if they suspect they have come in contact with someone who has COVID, they must inform the school. And as the school leader, you need to repeat that continuously. It must be always in the parents and the students' mind, I must inform the school so that I can protect the rest of the school, from having the impact of COVID. So that's got to be in place. But then if it does happen, you need to know how you're going to respond. So many schools in the situation would maybe shut down the school for at least a day, while they did cleaning and while they did contact tracing. So again, this is the idea in which we try and work out who was that infected student in contact with while they were at school. Now, this is quite a difficult process. You've got to work out when was that student most likely infected. And so between the time they were infected and now, who did they come in contact with? That might be the whole class or the whole school. Maybe you cannot differentiate. If they were running around together playing sport, it's everyone. But if you were able to isolate students in different zones and different classrooms, maybe you can confine those contacts just to a certain group of students. And those students then need to be quarantined at home and not come to school until they can be tested and verified that they don't have COVID. So responding to infections is going to be an important way that you minimize the chance of outbreak in your school. Now, also part of this is being able to change back and forward between the modes of learning. So if you are going on in your hybrid mode, you are doing one day on, one day off, all of a sudden, due to an infection, you have to have everyone at home. You don't really want to change the entire pattern of learning. Whatever they were doing at school on the on-campus day, have them do the same thing at home in the off-campus time. So don't try to avoid changing everything whenever you change modes of learning. So if on your normal on-campus learning day, there'll be a timetable, there'll be teachers with certain plans. If those teachers and the timetable can be replicated as best you can at home, then there's not so much disruption when you come in and out of distance learning. Now, it's not always possible. Sometimes it's impossible. But if it is possible to try and maintain the same structure, it will be less disruptive for students and families when these things happen. So these were the different topics that I tried to cover today. As I mentioned, we couldn't cover all the detail of everything, but I've just tried to give you areas to think about, right, as you plan for your schools. So we talked early on about working out what are the real risks and how are we going to manage those different kinds of risks, and making sure that our goals are clear to all the stakeholders and don't overpromise anything. Then in the second section, we had a look at the importance of communication, especially with parents and students, to make sure that during your crisis, they feel that you care about them and that you are considering their situation So they support you with your plans, and teachers also, of course. Then the third section was about the systems that you put in place, the procedures that you put in place to make sure they're sustainable and resilient. Having people in charge of things, a written plan, making sure that you can review that plan regularly so you can update as circumstances change. The fourth one was about managing well-being and how schools are not just about learning facts from a textbook, it's also about social learning, communication, many different kinds of soft skills that are important to impart to our students. And we've also got to care about the well-being of our teachers because they are the front line for us. It's our teachers that deliver. We've got to make sure we look after their well-being as well as the students' well-being. And there are all kinds of ways of doing that. And it requires some creativity sometimes, getting students to talk and to share and to open up. The fifth area was about the hybrid modes of learning. So there are many different ways of doing it, but the key idea is to manage social distancing at school and also minimizing contact between different groups. There are many ways of doing it and many challenges, but many schools start off in that kind of way after coming back from a period of distance learning. And then finally, about learning loss and adaptation. We've got to make sure that our teachers know about how to adjust the curriculum and know about how to adjust the assessment and become learning entrepreneurs to make sure they can achieve the learning outcomes that have been given to them, that have been adjusted for them, so that we can maximize this time, but then also bring those skills forward into non-COVID times so that we improve our practices in general when it comes to responding to assessment and making sure that we are efficient in the way we teach our students and maximize their learning. So that's kind of a brief summary, and I do want to thank everyone for their participation, for your good comments and questions, and for the sharing that you've made about your communities. It's made this much better because of it. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Mala.